Ridgeview Lane had always been the kind of street where people waved to each other while mowing the lawn, where kids rode their bikes in lazy loops until the streetlights came on. The cul-de-sacs were lined with tidy lawns and maple trees that turned a brilliant red in the fall. Cedar Hills, Colorado wasn't exactly a place where you locked every door, though most people still did out of habit. On the night of October 13, 2014, nothing about Ridgeview Lane suggested trouble. The air was crisp, just enough to make the breath visible. Houses were dark by midnight, the kind of darkness you get in suburban neighborhoods where early mornings are the norm. But somewhere on that street, trouble had already arrived. It was hiding, patient, and very, very quiet. Melissa Grant had been on her feet for almost 10 hours. The Silver Peaks Casino Resort in downtown Denver had been unusually busy for a Monday night, and by the time she slipped out the staff exit at 3:05 a.m., the city felt deserted. Neon signs still glowed along the boulevard, but the sidewalks were empty. She carried her black leather handbag close, the way she always did after late shifts, keys looped through her fingers. Her coworkers knew Melissa as someone who never looked tired, even when she was. Tonight, though, her smile was softer, almost absent-minded. She told the shift supervisor she was looking forward to sleeping in. Chloe was spending the night at her father's house, and the next morning would be unusually quiet. She pulled out of the casino parking lot, merging onto the near-empty highway. The drive to Cedar Hills took just over 30 minutes at this hour. She'd done it hundreds of times before, each curve in the road as familiar as her own kitchen. What she didn't know was that her kitchen light was already on. Earlier that evening, Ridgeview Lane had been still except for the occasional hum of a passing car. The street lamps threw soft pools of yellow light over driveways and mailboxes. Somewhere in the middle of that calm, a man had walked up Melissa's driveway and into her garage. He had a key, one she didn't know had been copied. Inside, he moved with practiced steps. He knew where the interior door was. He knew how to lock it behind him. And most chilling of all, he knew exactly where to stand so she wouldn't see him until it was far too late. He waited in the dark. Melissa's garage door hummed open at 3:32 a.m. Her sedan rolled in, headlights sweeping over the walls before going out. She stepped from the driver's seat, shut the door, and crossed to the entrance into the house. Her heels made a soft click against the concrete, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else is silent. Inside, the house smelled faintly of vanilla from the candle she'd burned the night before. The carpeted stairs rose just ahead of her. Maybe she was thinking about setting down her bag, maybe she was already picturing her bed. She reached the first step. That's when the shadow moved. What happened next would only ever be pieced together from forensic evidence and one man's confession. A figure stepped out from the darkness at the top of the stairs. There was no greeting, no warning, just the sharp, sickening crack of metal striking bone. Melissa staggered backward, her handbag slipping from her shoulder. "Why are you doing this?" she cried out, her voice breaking, disbelieving. But the attacker didn't answer. Another blow came, and another, each one more deliberate than the last. The sound of the struggle was muffled by the walls, but force leaves traces and he left plenty. When it was over, she lay still on the floor at the base of the stairs. The attacker's breathing slowed. He bent, picked up the weapon, a hammer with a cracked handle, and disappeared the same way he had come, through the garage and into the night. On Ridgeview Lane, no one saw him leave. No one saw the way he walked quickly but not too quickly, heading toward a side street where the street lamps didn't reach. Whatever vehicle he used to vanish was parked far enough away that no engine noise woke a neighbor. The only sound left in the house was the faint tick of the kitchen clock. Hours later, the sun rose over Cedar Hills. The maple trees glowed in the early light. Newspapers landed on porches, sprinklers ticked to life. On Ridgeview Lane, nothing looked different from the outside. But just after 9 a.m., a gray pickup truck pulled into Melissa's driveway. Daniel Rhodes climbed out, still wearing his fire department t-shirt from the overnight shift. Chloe waited in the passenger seat, her hair still tangled from sleep. Daniel had come to pick up some of her clothes before school. The garage door was open. Daniel froze in the driveway. Melissa never left it open. Never. That fact alone set off a prickle at the back of his neck. He told Chloe to stay in the truck and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Then he saw the handbag on the floor by the stairs, contents scattered, lipstick tube, keys, wallet. His eyes moved upward, and that's when he saw her. Melissa lay on the carpet, her head turned slightly to one side, eyes closed, a shadow of dried blood beneath her hair. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel's voice was tight when he called 911, his words stumbling at times, pausing as if he couldn't find the next one. He mentioned Chloe, said she was with him, asked if he could take her to his mother's house. On the recording you can hear him trying to sound steady, but every so often there's a crack. By the time first responders arrived, the scene had already turned their stomachs. The attack had been brutal, personal. One paramedic later admitted that for a moment, they thought Melissa had been shot. The wounds to her head were that severe. It wasn't until the coroner's team examined her closely that the truth came out. She had been beaten with a blunt object over and over, long after the first blow should have knocked her unconscious. Her hands told another part of the story. Cuts across the knuckles, bruises along the palms, signs she'd fought back until she couldn't anymore. In Cedar Hills, word traveled fast. By mid-morning, neighbors were standing on porches, whispering. The sight of police tape cutting across Melissa's driveway was almost unreal. People replayed the night in their heads, trying to remember if they'd heard anything unusual. A few recalled the faint thud of something heavy, but at 3:30 in the morning, they'd assumed it was nothing. To the detectives it was already clear. This wasn't random. It was targeted. Whoever had been inside Melissa's house knew she'd be home late. And they hadn't come to steal. They'd come to kill. That's where the story begins, not with the murder itself, but with the shadows that had been gathering long before that October morning. Shadows that had names, faces, and motives. And as investigators would soon learn, they'd been moving quietly along Ridgeview Lane for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before her name became a headline, before Ridgeview Lane turned into a crime scene, Melissa Grant was simply Melissa. Someone you'd meet once and remember. She was born in 1972 in a small town outside Helena, Montana, the youngest of 6 kids in a family where hand-me-downs were the norm and Sunday dinners were sacred. Her father worked maintenance at the local high school, her mother was a librarian. The Grant household wasn't wealthy, but it was full of noise, books, and the kind of small joys that stick with you. Snow forts in the winter, sweet tea on summer evenings, and the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen. Melissa grew up watching her older siblings leave for college, jobs, and marriages, each departure planting a quiet determination in her. She didn't just want to leave, she wanted to build something entirely her own. From Montana to Colorado. By her early 20s, Melissa was ready for change. Montana had been good to her, but she felt its limits closing in. A close friend had moved to Colorado and painted pictures of wide streets, mountain skylines, and opportunities that seemed just a little bigger. She arrived in Denver with 2 suitcases, $600, and a smile she swore could get her through anything. At first, she worked the floor of an upscale department store. Customers came for the brands, but they left remembering the woman who knew how to listen, who noticed the details. A tie that matched a shirt they bought last month, the story behind why they needed a new dress. It didn't take long before she was recruited into the hospitality industry. Melissa didn't just serve tables. She had a way of making people feel like the night was better because she was part of it. She thrived in the hum of hotel lobbies and the quiet camaraderie of late-night staff, eventually landing a position at the Silver Peaks Casino Resort. The meeting that changed everything. In 2003, at a charity event for the local fire department, Melissa met Daniel Rhodes. At first glance, Daniel looked every bit the small-town hero, tall, broad-shouldered, a calm confidence that drew people in. His handshake was firm, his smile easy. He told her about his time in the Army, his years as a firefighter, the rescues that still woke him up at night. He didn't embellish, he didn't have to. He had the kind of resume that spoke for itself. High school football captain, veteran, public servant. To Melissa's friends, Daniel seemed like the man you hoped she'd meet. Stable, dependable, the kind who could match her warmth with his steadiness. Their connection was quick, almost effortless. Within 2 years, they were married on a quiet stretch of beach in Florida. Family and fractures. When Chloe was born, Melissa's world shifted. She had always been nurturing, now it became her central purpose. Photos from those early years show her and Chloe in matching pajamas, frosting cupcakes, reading bedtime stories on the living room floor. But somewhere under those picture-perfect moments, cracks began to form. By 2008, the economic downturn hit Daniel hard. The extra shifts at the fire station didn't make up for the investment losses, and money, the one thing they'd never fought about, became their sharpest argument. Melissa liked to treat herself, to make their home comfortable and their daughter's childhood memorable. Daniel preferred to save, to keep things tight, until the market recovered. What began as quiet disagreements turned into shouting matches, sometimes in front of Chloe, the stranger in their lives. It was around this time that Daniel brought Travis Cole into the picture. He'd met Travis outside a hardware store, offered him cash to mow the lawn, then began hiring him for odd jobs. Travis wasn't the kind of man Melissa wanted hanging around. He was polite enough, but there was a certain watchfulness in his eyes, as if he was always sizing up a room. His clothes were worn, his stories inconsistent. Melissa told Daniel she didn't trust him, but Daniel brushed it off, insisting Travis just needed a chance. The more Travis appeared in their yard, the more Melissa withdrew. She couldn't quite explain it, but she started double-checking the locks. A new address, a new hope. By 2013, Melissa made the decision to move out. She found a 2-story home in Cedar Hills, a place with quiet streets and enough space for Chloe to ride her bike without worry. Though she and Daniel were separated, divorce wasn't yet on the table. There was still counseling, still the hope, faint as it was, that they could fix things. Melissa kept busy with work, juggling shifts and school events for Chloe. On days off, she gardened, read novels, or hosted small dinners for friends. She was rebuilding piece by piece. The break-in. Then, 3 weeks before the night that would change everything, Melissa came home to find her world slightly out of place. The back door had been forced open. Drawers in her bedroom were pulled out. Jewelry boxes stood empty. The items missing weren't just valuable, they were personal. A silk blouse she'd worn on a vacation with Daniel, a black dress from their anniversary dinner, her wedding ring. And then there was the vodka, gone from the fridge. But it was what was left that unsettled her most. A man's underwear, folded neatly, placed on top of her washing machine. She called the police. They took fingerprints, photographed the scene, asked about recent visitors. But in the end, there was little they could do without a clear suspect. Melissa tried to move forward, but every sound at night seemed louder now. Every creak of the floorboards made her heart catch. Life goes on, until it doesn't. Despite the unease, Melissa carried on. She needed to. Chloe's school schedule, the bills, the routines, they didn't pause for fear. Her coworkers noticed she was a little more tired, but she was still Melissa, quick with a joke, generous with her time. On the evening of October 13, 2014, she clocked in for another late shift at the casino. The work was steady, the conversations with guests predictable. When she left at 3:05 a.m., no one could have guessed they were seeing her for the last time. She got into her sedan, drove the familiar route to Ridgeview Lane, and turned into her driveway. Inside her house, the shadow was waiting. This was the life Melissa built, one that should have been protected by the very people closest to her. Instead, it had become the stage for a betrayal that would unravel everything she knew about love, trust, and safety. And the people who would come to investigate her death would soon learn that the break-in weeks earlier had never really ended. It had only been the first move. October 14, 2014, began for Melissa Grant the same way it had so many times before, with a late shift at the Silver Peaks Casino Resort. The casino was in that odd lull between summer tourism and the holiday rush. Guests drifted between blackjack tables and slot machines, their faces lit in alternating washes of neon and shadow. Melissa moved easily through it all, refilling drinks, checking in on regulars, trading quick jokes with the other servers. But under the casual rhythm of her night, something darker was aligning elsewhere. Closing out the shift. Around 3 a.m., Melissa checked the time on her phone. Her feet ached in that dull, persistent way that came after hours of standing, but she wasn't in a hurry. She knew the roads would be clear, the drive quiet. By 3:05 a.m., she'd slipped out the staff exit, the door clicking shut behind her into the cold, still night. The air in downtown Denver was crisp enough to make her pull her coat tighter. She crossed the lot to her sedan, keys already in hand. The route home was muscle memory. Merge onto I-25, keep right for Highway 36, watch for the glow of the streetlights thinning into the darkness of Cedar Hills. She drove with the radio low, headlights carving a tunnel through the empty road. Meanwhile on Ridgeview Lane. At that same moment, Ridgeview Lane was silent. Houses sat in perfect stillness, the occasional hum of a refrigerator or the distant click of a thermostat the only sounds inside. Except for one house. The front door was locked. The windows were locked. But the garage could be opened with the right key. And the man who had that key had already let himself in. Inside the dim garage, the smell of motor oil mixed with the faint sweetness of an old air freshener. Beyond the interior door, the house lay dark except for the faint digital glow of a microwave clock in the kitchen. The man moved upstairs without turning on a single light. He knew where each step was. He knew how to stand just out of sight. And he knew that Melissa would be coming home soon. The arrival. At 3:32 a.m., the sound of the garage door opening filled the space. Melissa's sedan rolled in, headlights sweeping briefly across the walls before they shut off. She got out, handbag over her shoulder, her mind probably still in work mode, thinking about the shift she'd just finished, the relief of knowing Chloe was safe at her father's, maybe even debating whether to make tea before bed. She stepped into the house through the interior door, closing it behind her. The air inside was cooler than she expected. The stairs rose just a few steps ahead, their beige carpet soft underfoot. First contact. Later, investigators would reconstruct what happened in those next moments. The attacker had been waiting at the top of the stairs, in the deep shadow where the hallway met the landing. Melissa placed her handbag on the first step, maybe to adjust her coat, maybe to take off her shoes. That's when he moved. The shape of him would have startled anyone. Broad enough to block part of the hallway, silent until the last possible second. The first blow landed with a force that stole her breath. Pain and confusion collided in an instant. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not shouted, not screamed, but pleaded. It was the kind of question you ask when you recognize that what's happening isn't random. There was no answer. Only the next blow. The struggle. Melissa tried to get up, but he was on her. She reached for the banister, nails scraping the wood, but the strikes kept coming. She put up her hands, defensive wounds, the coroner would later note, and twisted away. The sound inside the house was a muted, terrible rhythm. The dull thud of metal, the rasp of breath, the shifting of weight. Outside, no one heard enough to be certain something was wrong. When the handle of the hammer cracked, he didn't stop. He gripped what was left, the steel head, and kept going until Melissa's body stopped moving. The exit. The attacker stepped back, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. He looked down at her for a moment, then turned toward the garage. He carried the hammer with him. On the driveway, he kept his head low, walking briskly but not running. His vehicle was parked 2 streets over, out of sight from any curious window. By the time he pulled away, the neighborhood had already gone still again. Inside the house, the clock in the kitchen read 3:41 a.m. Morning. By sunrise, Ridgeview Lane looked like any other suburban street. Sprinklers clicked on. Joggers passed in sweatshirts and earbuds. The front of Melissa's house gave nothing away. At 9 a.m., a gray pickup pulled into the driveway. Daniel Rhodes climbed out, his daughter Chloe still in the passenger seat. He'd worked a 24-hour shift and had come to pick up some of Chloe's clothes before school. The garage door stood open. Daniel's steps slowed. Melissa never left the garage door open. Not overnight, not in the morning. He told Chloe to stay in the truck and walked inside. Discovery. The first thing he saw was her handbag on the floor near the stairs, its contents scattered. A lipstick tube, her wallet, a set of keys. Then he looked up. Melissa lay on the carpet at the base of the stairs. Her eyes were closed. Her hair was matted with blood. There was no movement, no sound. Daniel's voice on the 911 call was strained, halting in places. He said he'd found his wife, though they'd been separated for over a year, and that she wasn't breathing. He mentioned Chloe, asked if he could take her to his mother's. First responders. When the paramedics arrived, they found the scene much as Daniel had described, except worse. The injuries to Melissa's head were so severe that one of them thought she might have been shot. It wasn't until they examined her closely that the truth came out. Blunt force trauma, repeated with shocking ferocity. She had fought back. The cuts and bruises on her hands proved it, but she'd been overpowered. The house bore signs of a struggle, but nothing obvious had been taken. That morning, the police didn't yet know they were dealing with a murder planned weeks in advance. But they did know one thing: whoever had done this had been in that house before. And they were confident enough to wait in the dark for her to come home. When detectives arrive at a fresh crime scene, they start with the same unspoken rule: begin close, then work outward. It's not cynicism. It's pattern. Statistically, in cases of domestic homicide, the closest person is often the one responsible. That morning on Ridgeview Lane, the person closest to Melissa Grant wasn't a stranger. It was Daniel Rhodes. First impressions. Daniel stood in the driveway as officers came and went, his gray fire department t-shirt wrinkled from a long shift, his boots dusty. Chloe was inside his mother's house by then, shielded from the chaos. From the beginning, Daniel's demeanor was complicated. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't hysterical. His voice on the 911 recording had been low, almost subdued, and in the hours after, that same quiet carried over. Some officers read it as shock. Others made a note in their mental files. Muted emotion can sometimes mean something else. Detective Laura Bennett, the lead investigator, asked Daniel to walk her through his morning. The alibi. Daniel's account was straightforward. He'd worked a 24-hour shift at Station 17, starting at 8 a.m. the day before. His captain and fellow firefighters could verify he never left. He finished his shift at 8 a.m., picked up Chloe from his mother's, then drove straight to Melissa's to collect some clothes for her. When he arrived, the garage door was open. He told Chloe to wait in the truck, went inside and found her. It was clean. Too clean. If he was lying, there would be gaps or inconsistencies. But the station's logbook, security cameras, and the sworn statements of 5 firefighters backed up every word. If Daniel was involved, he hadn't been in that house when the murder happened. The scene speaks. Bennett turned her focus to the crime scene itself. Melissa's body had been positioned where she fell, without any attempt to hide or move her. That told them the killer wanted speed, to get in, finish, and get out. There were no signs of forced entry through the front or back doors. The garage door was closed when Melissa pulled in, meaning the killer either came in with her or was already inside. And given the quiet, the waiting, the precision, it seemed far more likely it was the latter. That meant access. His knowledge of her schedule. Neighbors and noise. Officers canvassed the street. Most neighbors had been asleep at 3:30 a.m., but a few remembered hearing something unusual. One man described it as rhythmic thuds, another as a banging sound that didn't fit the time of night. Both placed it between 3:30 and 4 a.m. No one saw a person or a vehicle. But when Bennett pulled up a satellite map of the neighborhood, she noted a cluster of side streets and walking paths that led away from Melissa's street without passing in front of many houses. A good escape route for someone on foot. A memory resurfaces. One of Melissa's closest friends, Aaron Latham, came to the station 2 days after the murder. She carried a folded sheet of paper and a nervous energy that filled the room. "I don't know if this means anything," she began, "but Melissa had a break-in 3 weeks ago." Bennett listened as Aaron described the incident. The missing clothes, the stolen wedding ring, the vodka from the fridge, and the most disturbing part, the neatly folded pair of men's underwear left on the washing machine. Melissa had been shaken, convinced it wasn't a random burglary. She even told Aaron she felt like someone had been in the house before she got home. The break-in had been reported, but the case went nowhere. No witnesses, no fingerprints that matched anyone in the system. The path to Travis Cole. The details of that earlier break-in nagged at Bennett. Whoever had done it had taken deeply personal items, not just valuables. That suggested obsession, or a message. As she dug deeper, one name kept surfacing in quiet mentions: Travis Cole. He was known in town, not in a friendly way. Mid to late 30s, drifting between day labor and couch surfing, sometimes staying in a tent on the edge of a wooded lot near the highway. A petty criminal record: trespassing, minor theft, drug possession. Bennett's ears pricked up when she learned Travis had once done yard work for Daniel and Melissa. And more than that, Daniel had kept him around even after Melissa asked him not to. Connecting threads. An informant named Ray Mitchell, who occasionally worked odd jobs for a grocery store near Cedar Hills, approached detectives after seeing news coverage of the murder. Ray claimed he'd overheard Travis bragging, in a joking, offhand way, about putting someone down with a hammer. Most people might dismiss that as drug-fueled nonsense. Bennett didn't. The weapon used on Melissa matched that description exactly. If Travis had been telling the truth even as a boast, he'd either witnessed the killing or committed it. Closing in. On October 20th, plainclothes officers spotted Travis near a gas station where he was known to deal small amounts of meth. He was picked up on a narcotics charge, a pretext to get him off the street while Bennett worked on the homicide link. At the station, Travis denied knowing anything about Melissa's death. But when asked where he'd been on the night of October 14th, his answers shifted. First he said he'd been at a friend's. Then he said he'd been camping out. Bennett ordered a search of his tent site. The tent. It sat on a rise overlooking a dry creek bed, shielded by thick trees. Inside, officers found what they expected: dirty clothes, empty food wrappers, and what they didn't. In a plastic grocery bag, wrapped haphazardly in an old hoodie, were a pair of dark work pants stained with blood. Forensics would later confirm the blood was Melissa's. Nearby, a half-empty bottle of vodka sat under a blanket. DNA swabs from the neck matched Travis. The brand was identical to the one taken from Melissa's fridge in the break-in weeks earlier. And in the dirt just outside the tent, partially buried, was a price tag from a hardware store for a fiberglass-handled hammer. A wider net. When confronted with the evidence, Travis stayed quiet, his eyes darting to the corner of the room. But as Bennett laid out the photographs, the pants, the vodka, the tag, his shoulders slumped. He asked for a cigarette. Then he asked what would happen if he told the whole thing. Bennett didn't answer. She just waited. What came next would open the investigation in a direction no one had been ready for. Travis claimed he hadn't acted alone. And the name he gave wasn't a stranger's. It was Daniel Rhodes. This revelation would force Bennett and her team to go back to the start, to every statement, every timestamp, every assumption about that airtight alibi. Because if Travis was telling the truth, then Melissa's murder wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a contract. Detective Laura Bennett had been in homicide long enough to know that confessions from men like Travis Cole came with a warning label. Handle with care. He'd been caught in lies before. He had a record full of petty crimes, drug use, and bad decisions. Defense attorneys could dismantle his credibility in minutes. But sometimes even a damaged source told the truth, especially when the truth was too specific to invent. The claim. Travis didn't waste time with denials this round. Sitting in the gray interrogation room, elbows on the metal table, he leaned forward and said, "It was Daniel's idea." Bennett kept her voice level. "Daniel Rhodes?" He nodded. "Yeah. He came to me, said he couldn't take it anymore. Said she was ruining him." Travis claimed Daniel offered him money, $800 up front, with a promise of $5,000 more once it was done. The instructions were clear. Wear black, get into the house before Melissa came home, wait in the dark and finish it fast. The preparation. According to Travis, they met twice in the week before the murder. One of those meetings, he said, took place in a hardware store parking lot. He wanted a hammer with a fiberglass handle, Travis explained. Said the wood ones break too easy. That detail made Bennett pause. The crime scene had shown a broken hammer handle. Could that mean the original plan had gone wrong? Travis smirked as if reading her thoughts. They didn't have fiberglass that night. Just wood. And yeah, it broke. Evidence in plain sight. Bennett sent 2 detectives to pull surveillance footage from every hardware store within a 10-mile radius of both Daniel's and Melissa's addresses. 3 days later, she had what she needed. A grainy but unmistakable clip of Daniel and Travis standing side by side in the checkout line, a hammer, gloves, and a utility knife on the counter between them. The timestamp? 3 days before Melissa's murder. The alibi under pressure. With the footage in hand, Bennett revisited Daniel's so-called airtight alibi. Yes, the firehouse log showed he'd been on shift the night of the murder. Yes, fellow firefighters swore he hadn't left. But the calls between him and Travis told a different story. Phone records showed 82 calls in the month leading up to the murder, with 6 in the 24 hours before Melissa died, the last one just after 10 p.m. that night. Firehouse phone logs also revealed Daniel had stepped out multiple times that evening, each for just long enough to make a private call from his cell. A sister's suspicion. While Bennett was building her case, Melissa's older sister, Diane Grant, flew in from Montana. She sat in Bennett's office, her voice low but steady. "I never believed he was innocent," Diane said. "Melissa told me about the fights, about him bringing that man, Travis, around. She was scared, but she didn't want to seem paranoid." Diane's presence added weight. She wasn't there to grieve in private. She was there to see it through, to make sure her sister's case didn't end in a cold file. The financial motive. The deeper Bennett dug, the clearer the picture became. Daniel was struggling financially. The separation meant he was paying support while splitting custody of Chloe. His debts had grown, and Melissa's refusal to sell the house, the one in her name, had made him furious. She was gone, everything changed. Custody, assets, financial obligations. The confrontation. On October 29th, Bennett brought Daniel in for a follow-up interview. She didn't start with accusations. She started with the hardware store footage, sliding the still image across the table. Daniel glanced at it, then looked away. "That's not me." "It's you," Bennett said plainly. "And it's Travis. 3 days before Melissa's death. Buying a hammer." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We were doing some work on my mom's porch." Bennett leaned forward. "Your mom says she hasn't had a porch in 5 years." For the first time since the investigation began, Daniel had no answer. The final link. Bennett knew a jury would need more than circumstantial evidence. The break came when forensics returned results from the price tag found outside Travis's tent. The store SKU matched exactly to the hammer purchased in the footage, and the packaging had a partial fingerprint belonging to Daniel Rhodes. With that, the chain was complete. Daniel bought the tool with Travis. Daniel had repeated contact with Travis before and during the night of the murder. Travis carried out the killing exactly as instructed. The arrest. On the morning of November 3rd, officers waited outside Daniel's driveway. When he backed his pickup out, they boxed him in. Bennett approached the driver's side, warrant in hand. "Daniel Rhodes," she said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Melissa Grant." He didn't resist. He didn't shout. He just stared straight ahead as the cuffs went on. The fallout. News of the arrest swept through Cedar Hills. Neighbors who'd once waved to Daniel in the mornings now avoided his gaze. At the firehouse, his gear was pulled from the lockers, his name removed from the roster. For Bennett, it was a milestone but not the end. The case still had to make it through the courts, and Travis's testimony, unreliable as it was, would be the centerpiece. But now Melissa's family had something they hadn't had in weeks: the hope that the truth would finally come out. This wasn't just about breaking an alibi. It was about dismantling the mask Daniel Rhodes had worn for years, the image of the devoted husband, the selfless firefighter, to reveal the man who had decided that murder was a solution. And in the next phase, that mask would be stripped away in full view of a jury. By the time the trial of Daniel Rhodes began in the summer of 2016, the people of Cedar Hills had stopped arguing about whether he might be guilty. Now the talk was about whether the jury would believe Travis Cole, the only eyewitness to the murder who was still alive. The courthouse sat on the edge of downtown Denver, a pale brick building with high windows and an echoing lobby. On the first morning of testimony, reporters lined the steps outside, their cameras aimed at the heavy glass doors. Inside, family members of Melissa Grant sat in the first two rows, their faces set in the stillness that comes when grief has calcified into something harder. The prosecution's case. District Attorney Karen Holt opened with a statement that set the tone. This is not a case of passion. It is a case of planning, of calculation. Daniel Rhodes decided that the only way to get what he wanted was to have Melissa Grant killed. And he found someone willing to do it for a price. She walked the jury through the timeline, the hardware store footage, the 82 calls between Daniel and Travis in the month before the murder, the 6 calls on the day itself. She spoke about the earlier break-in, the stolen items, and how they tied directly to what was found in Travis's tent. And she promised the jury they would hear, in Travis's own words, how Daniel had orchestrated every step. Travis on the stand. When Travis Cole took the stand, the air in the courtroom tightened. He wore a county-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands free but resting heavily on the wooden railing. His hair was longer now, his beard unkempt. His voice was flat, almost bored as he recounted the meetings with Daniel, the money offered, the instructions given, the night they bought the hammer. He said she'd be home late. Said I should wait inside, upstairs, where she wouldn't see me until it was too late. Holt guided him through the events of October 14th. The jury sat silent as Travis described the waiting, the sudden garage door noise, the moment Melissa walked in. I hit her. She went down. She asked me why I was doing it, but I didn't answer. Just kept going. Like he told me. The defense strikes back. Defense attorney Mark Delaney stood for cross-examination, his voice measured but sharp. Mr. Cole, you're a convicted felon, correct? Yes. You've lied to police before, correct? Yes. You use methamphetamine? Yes. Delaney paced slowly in front of the jury. And you are testifying here today in exchange for a reduced sentence on your murder charge, correct? Travis nodded. Yeah. 45 years instead of life. Delaney let the answer hang, then turned to the jury. So, you have every reason to say whatever the prosecution wants you to say, don't you? Travis stared back, unfazed. Doesn't matter. It's the truth. Evidence over words. Holt knew Travis's credibility could be picked apart. That's why her case leaned heavily on physical evidence. Surveillance footage of Daniel and Travis buying the hammer, gloves, and knife. The hammer's packaging found outside Travis's tent, bearing Daniel's partial fingerprint. Phone records showing constant communication between them, including late-night calls on the night of the murder. Melissa's blood on clothing recovered from Travis's tent, along with the stolen vodka bottle. Each piece was displayed on large boards for the jury, each link in the chain explained in plain, deliberate language. The mask slips. The prosecution's most quietly devastating witness wasn't Travis. It was Diane Grant, Melissa's sister. She told the court about Melissa's fear in the weeks before her death, about the way she double-checked the locks after the break-in, about the unease she felt with Travis hanging around. She didn't trust him, Diane said, her voice steady. And she didn't trust Daniel anymore either. She told me once, if anything ever happens to me, look at him first. Daniel's eyes dropped to the defense table. He didn't look up again until she stepped down. Daniel's turn. When the defense called Daniel to the stand, he walked up with a firefighter's posture, straight-backed, chin up. He admitted to knowing Travis, admitted to hiring him for odd jobs. He admitted they'd gone to the hardware store together, but claimed the purchases were for home repairs. As for the phone calls, he was helping me with some work. We were planning when to get it done. And the hammer's packaging found near Travis's tent? I must have touched it when we bought it. I didn't know he took it with him. Delaney painted Daniel as a man being framed by a criminal looking to save himself. My client was at the firehouse. He could not have been at that house. This is a story invented by a desperate man with nothing to lose. The closing arguments. Holt stood for her final argument, her tone quiet but resolute. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about whether Daniel swung the hammer. It's about whether he set it in motion. Whether he gave Travis Cole the means, the access, and the motive. The evidence tells you he did. The law tells you that makes him just as guilty. Delaney countered with an appeal to doubt. You are being asked to trust the word of a man who has admitted to killing Melissa Grant. If you cannot believe him, you cannot convict Daniel Rhodes. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers. On the charge of first-degree murder, they found Daniel Rhodes guilty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for conspiracy and related charges. Travis's earlier plea deal held 45 years with the possibility of parole in his late 70s. Aftermath. For Melissa's family, the verdict was justice but not closure. Chloe, now living with her maternal grandmother, would grow up knowing her father had arranged her mother's murder. Detective Bennett filed her final report with the quiet satisfaction that comes when the pieces fit. But even she knew the story would linger, in the house on Ridgeview Lane, in the neighborhood that still remembered the night everything broke. The trial had ended, but the shadow it cast would last for years. And in that shadow was the memory of a woman who had built a life out of kindness, only to have it destroyed by the person who once promised to protect her. The verdict had been read. The cameras had packed up and rolled away from the courthouse steps. But for the people who had lived inside the story, Melissa's family, her friends, even the investigators, there was no fade to black. The shadows on Ridgeview Lane didn't vanish when Daniel Rhodes was led away in shackles. Life without Melissa. Chloe was only 12 when she lost her mother. In the weeks after the sentencing, she moved in with her maternal grandmother, Diane, in Montana. The house there was quieter, the streets smaller, but the change didn't erase the reality she carried. At school, Chloe learned to navigate questions from classmates with short answers. Yes, my mom died. No, I don't want to talk about it. What she didn't say was that she still dreamed of Melissa, not the night she was taken, but the mornings when they'd sit on the porch sharing cereal and silly stories. The Grant family's mission. For Diane, grief became fuel. She founded Justice for Melissa, a local nonprofit aimed at supporting victims of domestic manipulation and covert abuse, the kind that doesn't always leave visible bruises. She spoke at community centers and college campuses, repeating a message she wished Melissa had believed sooner. If you feel unsafe even without proof, trust that feeling. And tell someone who will believe you. The group began hosting workshops on recognizing early warning signs, controlling behavior, isolation, sudden financial restrictions. All behaviors investigators later said Daniel had displayed. Daniel behind bars. Daniel Rhodes began his life sentence at the Colorado State Penitentiary. Former colleagues at the firehouse distanced themselves quickly. Some refused to even say his name when reporters came asking. Inside, Daniel kept mostly to himself. Prison officials said he maintained the same rigid posture he'd shown in court, shoulders square, gaze fixed forward, as though still convincing himself of a version of events where he was the wronged party. He filed an appeal in 2018, claiming ineffective counsel and mental health factors due to prescription medications. The appeal was denied. Travis Cole's fate. Travis Cole's 45-year sentence placed him in a medium-security facility 3 hours south of Denver. His cooperation had spared him a life term, but in prison, cooperator was a label that didn't earn friends. According to a correction source, Travis rarely spoke about the case. When he did, it was in vague terms, a bad deal, wish I'd walked away. Whether that was remorse or self-preservation, no one could say. Detective Bennett's reflection. For Detective Laura Bennett, the Rhodes case became one of those investigations that stuck, not because of the brutality, she'd seen plenty of that, but because of the planning behind it. People think murder is always about rage, she said in an interview years later. But sometimes it's about cold math. What they gain versus what they lose. That's what makes it dangerous, when it's a calculation, not a reaction. The case also reinforced her habit of looking twice at airtight alibis. Distance and time stamps don't mean innocence, she noted. They just mean you have to figure out how the pieces fit without them being in the room. The house on Ridgeview Lane. Melissa's home was eventually sold, though not quickly. Neighbors said buyers hesitated, knowing its history. Those who did come to see it often left quickly, sometimes after just standing in the garage, where the faint scent of motor oil and something indefinable seemed to linger. For the people on the block, the sight of police tape across that driveway was something they couldn't forget. Some changed their locks. Others installed motion lights. And for months after, conversations on porches circled back to that October night. Lessons learned. The case of Melissa Grant left behind more than a conviction. It was a cautionary tale about how manipulation can be masked as care. Daniel's reputation as a firefighter had shielded him from suspicion longer than it should have. The importance of small clues, the folded underwear from the break-in, dismissed by some as bizarre but irrelevant, was actually the earliest breadcrumb. The danger of minimizing fear. Melissa had told friends she felt unsafe. In hindsight, those fears were dead on. A memory that endures. In the Grant family home in Montana, there's a framed photograph on the mantle. Melissa standing in the Colorado sunlight, holding Chloe close, both laughing at something just outside the frame. Diane says it's the picture she looks at when speaking to audiences. That's who she was, light, warmth, humor. Not the woman in the court files. Every year on October 14th, friends and family gather in Helena to remember her. They don't talk about the trial or the hammer or Ridgeview Lane. They talk about the Melissa who could light up a room just by walking into it, the Melissa who never forgot a birthday, the Melissa who once drove 3 hours out of her way to deliver soup to a sick friend. Closing words. The story of the shadows on Ridgeview Lane isn't about a single night, though that's where it ended. It's about weeks, months, even years of choices that built toward it. Choices made by a man who believed he could erase someone to fix his own problems. Melissa Grant's life was taken by calculation, but her story remains through memory, through the work of her family, and through the lessons that may one day save someone else. And for those who lived through it, there's one more unspoken truth. On Ridgeview Lane, the shadows are still there, but now so are the lights that watch for them.